Our moderator today is Stephen Roady from Duke University, who is going to keep everyone disciplined in terms of their presentations, so we have ample time for Q&A. Our presenters are Kemerait from Fox Rothschild Law Firm, Claudia Leal from Universidad de los Andes, also a fellow this year in National Humanities Center, Claudia. Joseph Taylor, J. Taylor from Simon Fraser University, also a fellow this year. Marion Deerhake from RTI International, just retired, as I understand it. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And take it away, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Robert. And let me just say, we're honored to be here today, and we appreciate the invitation from Robert and Tanya and from the center. Sorry the weather hasn't cooperated. We're going to try to be bright and gay rather than gloomy and despair-like to sort of counteract the weather today. Our topic, as Robert mentioned, is policy and regulation, and we really have a glittering array of panelists this morning that I want to introduce to you briefly. But I want to just begin by giving you a quick overview. We have with us today a very experienced scientist and mediator and regulator in Marion. Then we have Karen, who's a lawyer and a marathon runner in her spare time. And then we have a geographer, environmental historian, filmmaker, and photographer, Claudia. Then we have Jay, who wants to be known as an historian, geographer, and a Westerner. He's a much awarded historian. So let me just begin by introducing Marion in a little bit more detail, if I could. Before I do that, I would just say that I'd like to observe, as President Kennedy once noted, that I think there's probably more brain power in the room this morning than was ever in the White House, except when Thomas Jefferson dined by himself. So there's a lot of brain power here this morning. We'll try to do justice to you folks. So Marion is an environmental scientist based in Raleigh. She's a gubernatorial appointee to the North Carolina Environmental Management Commission, which is a body of 15 volunteer members responsible for adopting and overseeing rules to protect, preserve, and enhance the state's air and water resources. She chaired the commission's Air Quality Committee for many years, and she currently is vice chair of its Water Quality Committee. As a longtime senior research environmental scientist with RTI International, Marion led a variety of contracted projects, primarily supporting the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in, among other things, air quality and hazardous waste management standards development and implementation, water quality policy analysis, including ecosystem services valuation and nutrient trading, livestock and poultry production environmental impact analysis, and renewable energy outreach, environmental justice outreach, and communication on air quality standards and social issues associated with hazardous waste facility siting, and ecological and human health risk assessments. Quite a celebrated career. She's also a certified mediator and an experienced workshop facilitator, so she'll help us facilitate today, I'm sure, on environmental topics such as climate change, health impacts. I'm going to go down the list and introduce everybody sort of, seriatim. So that's Marion's background, quite impressive. Karen, as I said, is an environmental lawyer and a marathon runner, but to be more specific, she's a partner with the law firm of Fox Rothschild in Raleigh, represents a number of renewable energy clients in energy-related matters at the North Carolina Utilities Commission and in Federal Energy Regulatory Commission related matters, in land use and zoning matters, and in developing and acquiring renewable energy projects. Her work includes involvement in state rate-making proceedings, avoided cost proceedings, which I'm sure she can explain to us, interconnection dockets, and dockets involving the competitive procurement of renewable energy. She, like I, received her undergraduate degree from Davidson College and her law degree from Wake Forest University. And I need to share with you the favorite course that both she and I took at Davidson. It was a two-year course in Humanities, which is a tremendous course at Davidson College. Everybody ought to go take it. In her free time, she enjoys spending time with her 3 sons and is a very competitive runner and cyclist, and including she's most recently competed in the Boston Marathon. So that's Karen, going to talk about, I think, about regulatory policy and maybe marathon running if we have time. And then we have Claudia Leal. She is a geographer, a PhD in geography. She teaches history at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia, where she grew up. She spends a lot of time on environmental history, but she's also worked on the transition from slavery to freedom and on race relations. Most of her work deals with rainforest regions. She's currently writing a book on the history of national parks in Colombia. She's written monographs, several books and articles, co-edited several books, and done some really fascinating other projects, including co-directing a documentary, organizing a photographic archive and an exhibit. And she is, I think, a very, very interesting person to have on the panel because she brings international perspective to some of the things we've been talking about today and yesterday. And finally, we have Jay, who is, as I say, historian, geographer, and a Westerner. He studied at the University of Oregon, University of Washington. He's written widely about contests over public resources in the North American West, especially on fisheries, outdoor recreation, gentrification, and conservation. His first book, entitled Making Salmon, An Environmental History of the Northwest Fisheries Crisis, won the George Perkins Marsh Prize for the best book in environmental history. His second book, Pilgrims of the Vertical, Yosemite Rock Climbers and Nature at Risk, won the National Outdoor Book Award for Best Book on History or Biography. Those of you who haven't seen the film, by the way, Free Solo, you need to go see that film, an Oscar-winning film about the kid who scaled El Capitan with no ropes. Astonishing film. Jay's also lead author for the Follow the Money website, which tracks the history of transfer payments from federal land management agencies to 414 counties in the American West since 1906. This fall, he'll publish Persistent Callings, Seasons of Work and Identity on the Oregon Coast. And this year at the center, Jay's been working on a new book titled 47% of the West, Congressional Conservation During the Long Progressive Era. So I'm sure you'll agree with me, we have this glittering array of talent, and what we'd like to do this morning is spend a little time. Each of these panelists is going to talk for 8 or 10 minutes, tell a story or two that we think shed some light on perhaps despair and getting beyond despair in their particular areas of expertise. So Marion, would you like to begin?
Thank you, and I am honored to be here and appreciate the opportunity to participate with you. It's been very informative and useful 2 days so far, and I look forward to the remainder of today. Everybody can hear me okay? Good. I would like to begin or focus on some history of air quality actions to demonstrate how episodes in public awareness affect change to help lead us to looking toward the future. So, as you know, the late 19th century's Industrial Revolution triggered anthropogenic air pollution in developed countries. We have natural air pollution today with the pollen. So if I pause occasionally, that may be why. Although U.S. awareness and action to address the human health and welfare impacts of air pollution began in the 1950s and 60s, it really didn't peak until the 1970 Clean Air Act. And since that time, air quality has improved. Between the 70s and 90s, we focused on reducing human health impacts from smog and criteria pollutants, which are pollutants legislated as carbon monoxide, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, mercury, lead, and volatile organic compounds leading to ozone formation. Two examples of improvements resulting from that. One is here in North Carolina. The non-attainment areas, areas that are considered out of compliance with air quality standards, have essentially zeroed out for carbon monoxide and volatile organic compounds in North Carolina. And there's been a substantial reduction in nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides. Another example is visibility or regional haze in national parks. That has improved. A prime example is in the Grand Canyon, where visibility improved with the interstate and tribal implementation of the 1996 Grand Canyon Visibility Transport Commission. Those recommendations were to reduce mobile and stationary source emissions, plus increase the role of federal land managers in permit decision-making of upwind sources. And I thought of Dr. Jackson's comments about what is natural in terms of a shifting baseline, as he was speaking about the other day. And this is a prime example where we are always struggling to define what is a natural baseline in these pristine national park areas, because federal land managers do have a voice in permit decision-making from upwind sources. The 1990 Clean Air Act amendments brought attention to acid rain impacts to fisheries and water quality. Title IV of that act succeeded through the creation of trading acidifying pollutants allocations for point source emitters. While recovery of acidified waters was realized, additional recovery remains for soils buffering capacity, impacts to forests, and aluminum toxicity to receiving waters. And those 1990 amendments also set a regulatory agenda to reduce air toxics emissions such as mercury, cadmium, and organics from stationary sources through the installation of control technology. Air toxics regulations and additional steps to further reduce criteria pollutants were sometimes challenged successfully in court, but states often took the initiative, sometimes litigating other states or using federal instruments, such as nitrogen oxide state implementation plan calls. North Carolina chose to sue the Tennessee Valley Authority directly, and in a 2011 settlement succeeded in the court requiring TVA to make substantial emission reductions. TVA installed control technology and closed select coal-fired power plants, significantly reducing pollutants, both criteria and mercury, that were transported to North Carolina. The Clean Air Act has not been reauthorized since 1990. Some may view that as despair. So states have had to work to meet their needs with state-level legislation and regulation. And in North Carolina, the Clean Smokestacks Act of 2002 achieved reductions in nitrogen and sulfur oxides, and as a co-benefit, some mercury emission reductions. The utilities installed control technology, closed some aging plants, and converted to cheaper natural gas as the fuel's production rates grew dramatically in the U.S. with the new extraction technology that everyone's quite aware of. And while significant strides have been made in NOx and SOx reductions, there's certainly still work to do. In particular for nitrogen, the ecological co-benefits of further reducing nitrogen emissions could include a decline in atmospheric deposition of nitrogen to nutrient-sensitive waters such as the Chesapeake Bay and the Albemarle-Pamlico estuaries, where algal blooms threaten aquatic life, human health, fisheries, and tourism. Awareness of such impacts relates to the concept of beneficial ecosystem services, in which services such as clean drinking water, fishable and swimmable waters, carbon sequestration, flood control, protection of endangered species and popular wildlife, and tourism are valued and are becoming an important part of the policy/cost-benefit decision-making equation. This alludes to Dr. Linden's remarks yesterday about fascination in science news, complications, seeking interest, and resolution, because through ecosystem services, the public is more directly able to relate to the issues and seeing real solutions being made to environmental challenges. So at the same time, states have worked to implement federal and state legislation to address stationary source pollution. Mobile source emissions have also been declining, and federal negotiations with automakers are driven by tightening regulations have produced significant fuel efficiency, decreasing nitrogen oxide emissions. But as we know, there have been setbacks with that, and there's much work to be done. Of course, our society's acceptance of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxides, and other air pollutants can act as greenhouse gases has only gained traction in the U.S. in the past decade. So while we've tackled many pollutants since the 1970s, we're only beginning to work to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. No federal climate legislation has been enacted, and it required a 2007 U.S. Supreme Court decision that carbon dioxide is a pollutant to enable the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan to be promulgated. Since then, the current executive branch's repeal and proposed replacement of the Clean Power Plan with the Affordable Clean Energy Rule and withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord has raised questions about whether current U.S. policy can fulfill satisfactory reductions and influence global policy to mitigate threats to our society, ecology, and quality of life as we know it. Certain states, including North Carolina, California, and a group known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a Northeastern States Collaborative, are leading efforts to reduce greenhouse gases through state policy and legislation. And in North Carolina, Governor Cooper this past fall signed an executive order number 80 dealing with greenhouse gas emissions to achieve 40% reduction by 2025. So while the U.S. has made strides to improve air quality, we become aware that our efforts continue and must continue to address previously unrecognized or in some cases unacknowledged threats, as well as emerging pollutants introduced by technology development. So I think our hope or our reliance on generational transition can play out to make improvements where we're needing. The new Green Deal is an example of a new generation's approach to improvements. However, climate change impacts, we don't know whether waiting on a generational change will work. We have much work to do very quickly with that. And those are my remarks.
Thank you very much, Marion. This is a really nice segue into Karen. One of the things Marion was mentioning is this obviously existential threat of global warming and climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And Karen, that's where Karen lives. Part of her legal life is to push for alternative energy operations in this state and elsewhere, which would, of course, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, Karen?
Okay. Thank you. And as Steve mentioned, I am a renewable energy attorney, and I'm going to be talking about a topic that I am truly passionate about renewable energy and the regulation that is involved with renewable energy. And these involve issues that I think about every day, on a daily basis, about the challenges politically and technological challenges that we face with renewable energy, and then ways that we might be able to solve those political and technical challenges. And so we are facing so many issues and difficulties in the country currently, but what I want to do is not overlook the successes that we have from an environmental and sustainability standpoint as well. So this morning, I'll be talking about our country's success story for renewable energy, and of course, renewable energy is generally considered to be solar energy, wind energy, biomass, and geothermal energy. And I'll also be talking about how we got where we are today and the challenges that clean energy is currently facing. And to begin with, I want to provide a proposition that I think that we are in the midst of what's been called a quiet energy revolution in North Carolina and then also across the country. And I don't think it's an overstatement to describe it as a quiet energy revolution. But that revolution was actually started back in the 1970s with federal legislation under the Carter administration that was called the Public Utilities Regulatory Act of 1978, and it's referred to by the acronym of PURPA. And I'll talk in more detail in a few minutes about PURPA, but PURPA is widely viewed as the most important piece of legislation for renewable energy in our country. And it was PURPA that was the driver that catapulted renewable energy into the energy markets. And in order to understand the importance of PURPA, we need to understand that in order to have electricity powered by renewable energy, there has to be a market for the renewable energy, and that's what PURPA created. And I'm also going to talk about the efforts by our individual states to encourage the development of renewable energy. Then, for example, to require that renewable energy be used by our utilities, for example, Duke Energy in North Carolina, and that has been done through regulation. And so along with PURPA, state regulation has really been instrumental in the explosion of renewable energy, and in particular of solar energy in some parts of the country. But I'm going to begin by talking about some of the recent successes for renewable energy. 2018 was a banner year for corporations purchasing renewable energy. In 2018, U.S. companies purchased 6.43 gigawatts of renewable power, which is more than double the amount in 2015. And that, for context purposes, is enough to power about 1.5 million homes. And today, there are 53 Fortune 500 companies that have 100% renewable energy goals. And that's compared with 23 Fortune 500 companies in 2017. But it's not just corporations and companies that have ambitious clean energy goals, but many cities do as well. As of November 2018, 99 U.S. cities have committed to 100% renewable energy, and that's up from 50 cities in 2017. And then importantly, public perception about renewable energy and clean energy has recently undergone a pretty major shift. It's no longer the political wedge that I think that it used to be. Both progressives and conservatives are increasingly recognizing that renewable energy is a solution to address the challenges facing our economy, the electricity grid, and our natural resources. And I believe that voters from both parties are starting to recognize that clean energy is not just good for the environment, but it's also good for the economy because it creates jobs. And I believe that this shift in attitudes will have an impact on local, state, and federal elections, with more candidates embracing these clean energy political platforms than we've seen before. So with that good news, I want to talk about how did we get where we are today. And as I mentioned, PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Act of 1978, has been the single most important piece of legislation that has to promote renewable energy. And President Jimmy Carter had a vision for renewable energy when he took office. And his administration enacted PURPA in 1978, and that was the year after President Carter took office. And PURPA was passed in response to the 1973 oil crisis, in which it was believed that the price of oil was predicted to rise to about $100 per barrel. And the purposes of PURPA was to reduce our dependence upon foreign oil, to promote renewable energy, and to encourage conservation. But one of the most important long-term effects of PURPA is that it created that market for power from non-utility renewable energy producers. And before PURPA, only utilities could own and operate electric generating plants. PURPA also included a really important provision, and it was what's called a mandatory purchase provision. And that mandatory purchase provision was important because without it, the renewable energy producers would have nowhere to sell their electricity. And so this mandatory purchase obligation requires the utilities to purchase renewable energy at the utilities' avoided cost. So what that means is that the utilities have to buy the renewable energy at the price that they otherwise would be paying to construct a new coal, natural gas, or nuclear facility. And I believe that President Carter would really be surprised to realize at the time how successful the PURPA legislation that he advocated for in encouraging renewable energy. And in addition to PURPA, there's been other federal efforts that have encouraged renewable energy. And under the Obama administration, the federal government enacted renewable energy tax credits to provide tax incentives for developing solar, wind, geothermal, and landfill gas renewable energy projects. States have also played an important role in renewable energy, and many states adopted what's called renewable energy standards. And these renewable energy standards require utility companies to purchase or generate a certain amount of energy in their portfolio from renewable energy sources. And renewable energy standards have incremental goals to purchase more renewable energy over time. And more than half of the states have some sort of renewable energy standards, and also not just the states, but Washington, D.C. does as well. So I'd like to mention a success story for solar energy in North Carolina. 10 years ago, there was almost no large-scale solar energy in North Carolina, but the North Carolina General Assembly had a vision for renewable energy, and in 2007, our General Assembly enacted the North Carolina Renewable Energy Portfolio Standards, which is called the REPS standards. And the REPS required Duke Energy to purchase 3% of renewable energy in 2012, 6% in 2015, 10% in 2018, and then 12.5% in 2021. So as a result of PURPA and North Carolina's REPS standards, there has been a tremendous investment from renewable companies for solar, wind, biomass projects. So as of 2018, North Carolina is ranked number 2 in solar energy generation, only behind California. And we have about 7,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity, and that is not just solar energy, it's solar, wind, biomass projects that have been developed in North Carolina. And there's been a tremendous economic benefit. We've created 35,000 full-time renewable energy jobs. There's 997 renewable businesses, and we have $6.4 billion in revenue. But there's also been some recent setbacks for renewable energy. The North Carolina General Assembly imposed a moratorium on the development of onshore wind farms a couple of years ago. And at the end of last year, the moratorium expired and was lifted. And so many of us in the state were hopeful that we would see the development of some onshore wind farms. However, earlier this week, the North Carolina General Assembly, the House, introduced a bill to reinstate the moratorium on wind in certain eastern counties in North Carolina. And so as I mentioned, we're in the midst of a quiet renewable energy revolution, but as part of that revolution, we're also in the middle of a national debate about PURPA and solar energy. In recent years, a number of utilities in different states, including Duke Energy in North Carolina, have been mounting battles against PURPA. Duke Energy has complained about what they call an explosion of renewable energy facilities in North Carolina and has been advocating for PURPA reform. And then recently, Republican members of the Foreign Senate and House Energy Committees have said that the 40-year-old PURPA is no longer relevant, and they want to reform it so that we can now have a free market competitive process. And I'm going to speak very briefly about North Carolina. North Carolina did not wait for this federal PURPA reform. There had been, as background, quite a bit of tension between Duke Energy and the renewable energy providers for a number of years. So a few years ago, Duke Energy lobbied the North Carolina state legislatures to reform PURPA on a state level. And in 2017, the General Assembly enacted House Bill 589 that requires Duke to procure a large amount of renewable energy, 2,660 megawatts by 2021. But they also have changed the process from a PURPA mandatory purchase process to a free market competitive process. So House Bill 589 will allow for a robust renewable energy market until 2021, but after that, there is no long-term vision for renewable energy in North Carolina, which means that the future for renewable energy after 2021 is very much uncertain. And while the national purple reform is being considered, we also have the Green New Deal that's been recently introduced that has an exciting, or I should say an ambitious vision for renewable energy. Legislation like PURPA, the Renewable Energy Standards, and the Green New Deal, if it's ever enacted, obviously provide important goals and vision for renewable energy, but these goals will provide very little benefit for renewable energy unless we also address the technical challenges facing renewable energy. For example, we need to solve the technical interconnection challenges that are preventing renewable energy from interconnecting in a timely fashion. What is occurring now in North Carolina and many states is that it takes 3 to up to 10 years for renewable energy to interconnect to Duke Energy's grid. So while we're considering the Green New Deal and purple reform, I think we cannot lose sight of other technical challenges that are equally important on a state level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Well, there's a lot to be hopeful about there and some to be concerned about. I think sort of a mixed bag. Well, from deep in the regulatory jungle of the United States and North Carolina, we now move to Claudia, who is going to talk to us a little bit about her perspective on issues from Bogota.
It's a pleasure to be speaking in this building that has become my home in the last months. So how could I not take advantage of this opportunity to thank Robert, Tanya, and really everyone at the National Humanities Center for this amazing opportunity. So in my 10 minutes, I want to tell you a couple of stories about deforestation. I'll start the first one in 1991, when the Brazilian government decided to stop approving fiscal incentives for business projects in the Amazon, which are mostly used for ranching. This change in policy in the Brazilian government had a lot to do with changes in ideas, in the way we conceive forests. For the longest time, and for those of you interested in literature, if you look at some of the foundation narratives of some of tropical Latin American countries, you will find the stories that talk about hellish jungles. And these hellish jungles needed to be destroyed and needed to be developed, and that idea was very important in creating incentives that were used, especially in the 70s and 80s, and that contributed enormously to an upsurge in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, and really in all the Amazonian countries. So, but that same destruction created something that you probably all know about, this uproar about what was happening. And many people and groups participated in changing the idea of threatening jungles to endangered tropical rainforests that needed protection. And what we see here is Sting, who teamed up with Chief Mequeiture from part of the Brazilian Amazon and talked to several leaders, world leaders, about the threat that these indigenous groups and the rainforest of the Amazon were having. So this change of idea was fundamental. In the 1980s, a lot of protected areas were created throughout the Amazon countries. National parks partly, but also indigenous reserves, and in the case of Brazil, extractive reserves that were for peasants who used extraction of forest resources as a way of living, rubber, but also other kind of forest resources. A fundamental piece of policy came out later on in 2008, which forbid or did not allow properties which had fine spending with environmental agencies to receive loans for agriculture or cattle ranching. And these measures were fundamental in changing the trends of deforestation. You can't read that map from that graph from where you are, but the first peak that you see there is 1995, and if we go back, you could see higher trends before. Then the second peak is in 2004, and that's when deforestation starts coming down. And it hits a low in 2012. The reduction is of 84%, so it's really astonishing, and it starts climbing slowly initially after that. So we could conclude that policy was incredibly effective in curbing deforestation, and sure enough, it was. But we also have to be worried because it was not only policy. The sharpest and initial decrease after 2004 mirrors the decrease in commodity prices, mainly beef and soy. But the leveling of deforestation afterwards owes a lot to the commitment of the PT, the Workers' Party in Brazil, of committing to curbing deforestation. However, the change in the Forest Code in 2012 that made it easier to get permits is in part responsible for the increase after that. But this comes from a different source, so it's slightly different, but the trends are pretty much the same. What we see, it's a humongous increase in deforestation in 2016 and 2017, and probably also in 2018. The data is not available yet. So the history of Brazil shows us several things. One, policy matters. Policy did, in fact, create a change, but policy is fragile. The recent increase in deforestation in the Amazon has a lot to do with political turmoil in Brazil and the change towards a right-wing government. First, President Temer, and now Bolsonaro. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with Bolsonaro, but, doesn't look rosy. But there are other important messages here, and it's that policy is not the only driver of deforestation, and it's not the only reason why deforestation happens. Markets are also important, and I would say that for me the most important thing here is that policy is fragile, and that we cannot take for granted successes of a certain period, no matter how important and long they are. Things can change in a matter of just a year. 2017 was the year of highest deforestation worldwide that we know in history, and Brazil was a country that contributed the most to deforestation that year. Now I'm going to move to my country, to Colombia, to this, not exactly this farm, although this farm is close to the one I'm going to be talking about. And I'm going to be talking about a friend who I'll call Jose here. I visited Jose a couple years ago, and he told me a story that touched my heart. He was telling me of one dry season in which he cleared a couple hectares of forest, as they always do. In that particular year, he went with his notebook and counted. This is one of his pastures. And that particular year, he went out with his notebook and counted the charred animals that he found in the area that he had burned, especially morrocos like this one, because they obviously cannot get away. And he wanted to go to the National Park Agency because Jose happens to live illegally within a national park. But the national park rangers are never to be seen in the park or around his house. So he wanted to go and show his list so that they would realize the cost of burning and would do something about it. But his brother, who's a lawyer, told him, brought him to his senses and said, you cannot do that, you'll be put in prison for damages to the environment. And Jose actually knew quite a bit about prison. Some years before, he had been put in jail in Bogota, accused of being a guerrilla commander. Because he does not only live in a national park, he also lives in an area that was controlled by the FARC for a couple of decades. And as part of a very strong army offensive, several leaders in the area were accused of being FARC commanders and were put in jail, but then they, among them Jose, were released free of charges. You might know that we had a peace treaty agreement with the FARC, and the FARC is now a political party. When the FARC withdrew from the area in 2015, Jose and his wife Ana were finally able to sleep the whole night in peace again. But they soon witnessed a tremendous upsurge in forest burning and forest clearing. And the reason is because it was the FARC that controlled forest clearing. What you can see here are the rules in a house in a nearby hamlet. I mean, supposedly these rules were enacted by the community, by the local community, and by the peasant organization, but without the guns of the FARC behind them. Nobody was obeying these rules since 1915. At this point, Jose and his wife are trying to learn to live with what we call the disidencia, the dissident groups of the FARC who did not turn in their arms. So what can we learn from these two stories? I'd say at the basic level that perspective and scale matter. Looking at things from the ground, they can look pretty messy. It is hard to figure out which are the policies involved here, who enacted them, how successful they were. But I would say that at a very basic level, one thing that we can draw, at least from the Colombian story, is that for policies to work, we need solid institutions. And to have solid institutions, we need to have solid environments in which these institutions can be built. But when you get a clearer picture from a broader picture like the one in Brazil, there are also costs for having that broader, clear view that we could, and that's the kind of view that we can associate very easily with this global problem, such as climate change, which is what makes deforestation so worrisome. What gets lost in these big stories that are illustrated by this deforestation map of the Brazilian Amazon are the texture and meaning of everyday life on the ground that make life and history meaningful for us. I would end by saying that there are many different perspectives that we could use to think about deforestation and the ways in which policy has impacted it. I wonder what other stories we would be able to hear if my son Nico, who wants to be an inventor and among other things wants to invent something that he calls a detector to understand what animals say, if he were able to create such a contraption, what kind of stories would we hear? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Claudia. That's a very interesting perspective. Now we turn to our Western friend, Jay.
Okay. Am I on? Yeah. Okay. First, I want to echo Claudia and saying thank you to everyone. This has been a wonderful, it's actually my second tour of duty here, and it's just been an incredible privilege. So I need to thank everybody here for the opportunity I've had this year. What I want to do today is talk about what I'm calling the problem of thinking of policy and regulation, laws and legal rulings as fixed or progressive stories. I'm going to focus on U.S. federal lands in particular here, but I think my points have much more global implication about them. And the way into this is to talk about Bears Ears National Monument and Grand Escalante Monument to begin with. And I just realized I should have put a map up here. These are two vast national monuments in southern Utah that, in terms of their size, if they were national parks, they would be the 5th and 9th largest national parks in the entire U.S. system. Except they're not. They were created through the Antiquities Act of 1906, which meant that the presidential proclamation ensued, which is different from national parks, which are created by congressional legislation. These were created in 1994 and 2016 by Presidents Bill Clinton and President Barack Obama, respectively. Both were declared in the heat of national federal elections, one before the election, one after. In both cases, if you look at their speeches, the presidents highlight the scenic and natural values of the place. Oftentimes, they also talk about the implications on Indian antiquities and the importance of protecting them, which are central to the Antiquities Act of 1906. But in both speeches, they also highlight the importance of shutting down natural resource activities, and coal in particular. And this led to what, in my mind, was an incredibly overdetermined reaction. For locals implicated in grazing or mining in these areas, and for the communities that depended upon the royalties from these activities to support schools and road building and other things, these were dire threats. And I was only surprised that a reaction did not happen until Donald Trump was elected. He campaigned on this issue as previous Republican candidates had, and when he won, he followed through in what was, to me, a surprisingly belabored process. I actually expected a much more summary reduction than the time it took to actually get to it. Now, the reaction to the reaction was also overdetermined. Environmentalists, the moment that, even beforehand, environmentalists were decrying the threat to public lands and the people's lands. They also raised the importance of thinking about these places as sacred native spaces, which is absolutely true. And they launched their court challenges to this. The problem with court challenges for me as a historian is that they happen and they have their own historical context. In terms of presidentially proclaimed national monuments, there have already been 22 reductions since the Taft administration. Presidents have acted unilaterally both to create these monuments and to reduce them over time. And this is a long history at this point, going over 100 years. That's an important historical context to consider with this, because courts pay attention to whether administrative actions go uncontested over a long period of time. Now, could add to this, because it's not just national monuments. Presidents have unilaterally reduced and even eliminated national forests, which are also created by presidential proclamation. And there is a long and sordid history of presidents creating Indian reservations and then unilaterally reducing them as well. So I have from a historian's perspective, a rather jaundiced view of the court challenges going on here. I'm not sure that they're actually going to succeed, and I'm not sure that they have much merit in terms of some aspects of those two monuments in particular. Now, I want to put that as one story I want us to think about. The other is the John D. Dingell Jr. National Conservation Management and Recreation Act. A mouthful to talk about, but in fact, the bill that was just passed in February and signed in March by President Trump that actually tremendously expanded the amount of wilderness area in the United States. It took years to pass this legislation because it took a long time for Congress to build a coalition, and with that, there's a lot of sausage in there as well. And people who have looked closely at this across time, or across the last month, have been unnerved by some of the things. One of them, and one of that's been protested widely by environmentalists, and why I have a jaundiced view of their relations with Indians this time, is the outrage, in this case by Christopher Solomon, about what he calls about the 500,000 acre giveaway of what he calls your land and mine to Native veterans who had qualified for homesteading in Alaska through legislation previously passed, but were blocked by environmentalists from actually filing on that. Those are all important contexts, because motives, intents, the rhetoric people use, and the consistency with which you build coalitions matter to understanding how people move forward with contests and with policy and regulation. I've heard a lot talked about over time about the people's lands, and the more research I do, the less I find it a compelling rhetorical framework. My own work, especially on the history of transfer payments between federal agencies and western counties, has underscored how much these lands have a political economy. And it's not just the federal government, but states, counties, and even municipalities who depend upon the revenues generated by these lands over time. So when we talk about federal lands, we're really not capturing the full implications of what goes on in those lands. And that's important for understanding just how messy these politics are. I'm a historian, and I'm speaking as an historian who is unusual, I think, among my colleagues in the fact that I love teaching the U.S. Survey. And it's partly because I get access to a very large group of students who are not history students. It's my greatest opportunity to infect them with the history bug. But I also like to do it because I can tell, especially with the U.S. History Survey, a whole narrative of American history. And what I point out to them early on is that the creation of the United States and the Constitution is actually a rather extraordinary historical moment. It's the first time we've ever had we have an example of people coming together and creating the rules at the front end of the government. And one of the consequences of that is that what it takes to be an American citizen is not a matter of descent at the beginning. It's an ascent. They are assenting to a series of rules by which they're going to fight. And the history of America is the history of an ongoing fight that has not been resolved. And I don't know that it can be in some ways. But that, I think, more than anything else, defines American history over a very long period of time. One of the things that I've come out of that in terms of thinking about these public lands issues is that presidential proclamations are not like a ratchet. It doesn't only turn one way. The history does not show that. The contest is, in fact, ongoing. But it's also, contrary to the dominant adversarial speech that frames our understanding of these political contests, it's not two-sided. It's many-sided, it's messy, it's dynamic, and the coalitions can shift very quickly from one side to another. I think rural versus urban is a very important framework for understanding a lot of really environmental politics on a much broader scale than just the United States. I think it's always important to understand that indigenous people cannot be subsumed within these frameworks. They have their own separate and dynamic interests and their own internal contests over these. As I said, the contests are ongoing. But I think that's important for going back to the theme of this conference, which is beyond despair. Now, one way you can go with that, beyond despair, is utter hopelessness. Another is moving towards some refined, idealized, utopic state. But another way of thinking about this is to simply embrace the notion that these are ongoing contests and they cannot be resolved. We want to think about some passing a law or getting a court ruling as the end of the debate. The history of the United States, and I would say the history of the world, suggests that that's never been the case, and I don't know that it can be. But I don't know that that means that we should be despairing. It's just a fight. It's one that defines us, and we should carry on with it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joe. That's a very thoughtful intervention. I'd like to, before we go to the audience questions, I'd like to pose a question or two for the panelists. And if you'll indulge me, I'll start with my own experience. The question, just to preview it, is, in your views, how do these policies and regulations come into being to begin with, and then how or why do they end up being effective? The short answer might be it's all about the money. It's just about the money, and that's why they come into being. It's not effective. I think it may be a little more subtle than that, a little more complicated than that. But in my experience, I helped write the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I was a staffer on the U.S. Senate Committee. And I can tell you it's pretty easy for me to trace why that act got enacted. It was because the summer of 1988 was one of the smoggiest, dirtiest, most polluted summers in the history of the United States. And people were screaming for public health help. And that really drove a lot. It drove President George H.W. Bush to put together his own bill and get it launched. Now, as Jay was just saying, it was hideously complicated. Just the fact that you had a bill to start off with wasn't any guarantee of success. But I can tell you, an industry fought it every step of the way, but there was enough public health concern behind that particular initiative that it seemed to drive it. It seemed to drive it. That said, I know it's fairly elementary here, folks, but we have this, 3 branches of government. So the executive launched this bill. Congress launched their own bills, by the way. But what's happened in the 28 years since the Clean Air Act of 1990 was enacted was we have been in a tremendously intense knife fight in the courts, trying to enforce the requirements that were enacted in the Clean Air Act, specifically with respect to hazardous air pollutants. We've been in court after court after court as the EPA has, frankly, been bent a bit by the pressure from industry to basically not regulate to the level of stringency that was required by the Clean Air Act. And so we've had to run to court to get the courts to send them back to do their job. It's been a really interesting exercise. So, enough about that. I'm just curious what the panelists think about, and for example, why did PURPA come into being and why has it been effective? Is it all about the money? Is it just about the fact they set up the market? Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just that simple. Just for example, Karen.
So I think that PURPA came into being because President Carter had a vision for renewable energy, plus it was at a time when the country was willing to listen to that vision and narrative because it was in response to the oil crisis of the 1970s. So I think that it was the situation that enabled the country to support it. With PURPA reform, I think it is about the money for the utilities. However, I think that what we need to do is ensure that there's discussion and negotiation so that there can hopefully be a compromise for PURPA reform, because I think we're likely to see it, but we need to continue to work to ensure that it is a better piece of legislation than some fear.
Marion, do you want to talk about your experience?
And I will just add, because I was there then too, I waited in lines while I was getting ready to enter college for my gasoline. President Carter came from an energy background, an energy education. He was in the U.S. Navy and trained at the nuclear submarine program in upstate New York. So he embraced alternative energy and he created Department of Energy as well in his administration, right? Mm-hmm. So, that was his vision, and he was the motivating factor behind that, as well as President Bush, I guess, with the 90 amendments. I can say that probably one perfect example, as I mentioned, the Clean Smokestacks Act. There had been a lot of debate for years about nitrogen and sulfur issues in our state, and it was not until some Western legislators realized the impact that coal-fired utilities were having on the quality of life for their residents and the tourism in Western North Carolina. Tourism is such a big factor and motivating factor, especially in North Carolina, for many decisions that are made. But it was their vision, along with some very innovative negotiations amongst the utilities and the state government in terms of cost recovery and rate setting that enabled the Easley administration to negotiate the Clean Smokestacks Act.
Jay?
Yeah, to go along with that, the Far West is a place that within the U.S. context is unusually reliant on hydroelectric, solar, and wind, the Pacific Northwest in particular. So selling people on non-carbon energy has always been a lot easier because, quite frankly, the region's been reliant on it for a very, very long time. And yet there are these unsettling themes below the surface in the last couple decades that are worth holding on to, again, to get back to a point I had earlier. One of which is that when the state of Oregon began to ramp up its wind energy back in the early 2000s, it provided vast subsidies to small companies to get in on this. Well, the small companies turned out to be very big companies, And in the long run, there was a lot of abuse of these subsidies across time, which has soured people on wind in a way that has very little to do with wind per se. The other thing is that with wind or solar, each has its own ecological costs, and we tend to, this is a long-standing cultural habit in North America and to a certain extent in Western Europe, where we tend to embrace the new technology as solving a problem without necessarily thinking through the new problems. With wind, bird kills can sometimes be really tremendous, and habitat loss and some of the implications of solar as well, not to mention also the fact that you got to mine in order to create all these technologies. So there are these, full cost accounting would help with discussing all of this. Everything still exists within the marketplace. And when you start creating subsidies for one energy system or another, which we have always done back to the beginning of coal, you're going to create enemies as well as friends because government will be tilting the balance of the marketplace.
Say a little something about energy. Latin America is an exception in the sense that hydroelectricity is the main source of energy rather than coal or other fossil fuels. Case of Colombia, Colombia has incredibly abundant water resources that are stored in the high Andes, and most of the population actually lives in the Andes, so it is a convenient match. The Caribbean coast, on the other hand, still lives mainly on energy produced by fossil fuels. But overall, the region looks very differently when you look at its energy sources than what you're looking at here. So the debate is it's a very different debate. And of course, we didn't have that strong industrialization, different issues with. Not to say that our cities are not horribly polluted, but if you look at it historically, it's different moments.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for those remarks. We're happy to go to the audience. Robert, if you want.
So let me introduce Nora Nunn, who's a PhD student at Duke in literature, who's been interning here for the past couple of years, helping us with our Humanities Moments project and a number of other projects as well. And she will have the microphone to bring to you, so please raise your hand.
Thank you. Extraordinary panel. Really enjoyed and learned a lot. My question is to Claudia. You quickly mentioned hellish jungles, quote unquote. You used the word hellish. So I want to just, hellish jungles. Just stay with that for a moment to think about the significance and the power of aesthetics in public policy, which we don't talk about often enough. And this relates very closely to the work that we have been doing in the during the George W. Bush administration. A top priority of his energy policy was to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas drilling. And during that time, aesthetic framing was the number one thing we were fighting. So the former Secretary of Interior, Gail Norton, described the coastal plain as a flat, white nothingness. Former U.S. Senator Ted Stevens described it as a frozen wasteland of snow and ice. Former U.S. Senator Frank Murkowski, father of current Senator Lisa Murkowski, held up a big, large, white poster board and called it, "This is what it looks like. It's ugly, it's flat, it's white. Don't be fooled." The very same place, the indigenous Gwich'in Nation describes it as sacred place where life begins. So the question I have is if you would be willing to go a little deeper on this articulation of hellish jungles, like who articulated that, who advocated that, how far did they take it, what was the counterpoint, if at all any, from either artists or writers? Because artists and writers play such important role in countering this this really damaging and extremely powerful articulation. So I wonder if you want to stay with that for a moment and help us, this articulation of hellish jungles.
I'll mention a few writers in Brazil and Colombia. Colombian, what was called like the national novel in Colombia, as La Vorágine, published in the 1920s, which translates as The Vortex. And it's the story of Arturo Cova, a man who goes to the Amazon and gets swallowed by the jungle. In Brazil, you have, for example, by Euclides da Cunha, major writer, who writes they published posthumously his work called A Margem da História, on the sides of history, like outside of history. You also have a major work, I forget the author right now, called Inferno Verde, that's green hell. But when you look at I'll just concentrate on the Colombian case, although the case of Euclides da Cunha is pretty much the same. These were men that were part of government commissions that had to trace the borders between countries in the early 20th century, just defined international boundaries. And the stories of their trips to the Amazon are pretty hellish. So I think there's something important here in the relationship, not just between images or aesthetics and policy, but between experience and aesthetics. It's lovely to see the jungle, and the butterflies, but the jungle is a very difficult place when you're not from the jungle. I love it, but like mosquitoes, I can't stand. My skin doesn't do well. When I lived in the jungle, I honestly thought that I would never be able to wear short sleeve again because my arms were just completely covered with mosquito bites. And every time I go back, I don't do particularly well. So I think we should just not dismiss these images and way of understanding different environments. It's the same as ice. I found it very interesting that you, coming from India, work particularly on the Arctic, because I can't deal with cold, and that would have not been, my choice at all. And the idea of going there, I would, your photographs, I looked at them when I knew you were going to be the keynote speaker. They're fantastic, but I would see them from the plane that you took the pictures rather than be wandering in that cold. So these places are difficult places. And we have to acknowledge that this is just not, some concoction, of some evil mind. Jungles can be hellish, the experience there can be incredibly difficult. They're also beautiful, rich, powerful. So I mentioned that the talk was very short, but alongside the idea of hellish jungles was the idea of rich, prolific, magnificent jungles. And also the idea of, an Eden, where primitive peoples could be, the true innocent people, the veritable soul of humanity. All these things got mixed up. But this idea of hellish jungles was particularly important to policy, to the idea that why would we want these forests? We really need to change forests. And of course, the thing is more complicated. It has to do with what's the ideal landscape. The ideal landscape is an agricultural landscape. Who's the ideal citizen? It's kind of a well-off peasant, and well-off peasants don't live in the forest. Well-off peasants live where you have corn and you have other, part of this agricultural landscape. So I wonder if I responded to your question.
If I can go
Jay.
I want to add something to this. Worthless lands is a long-standing concept in terms of the battle over landscapes. And they've been used to both justify sacred and sacrificial spaces. Just sticking with Anwar, you always have to remember that the aesthetics is always put into a broader context. With the push towards opening up Anwar in the early 2000s during the Bush administration, we always have to remember that depiction of a flat and barren, desolate landscape actually had a lot of traction, not just because the photographs, if you take landscape photographs of that place, it's flat, it's white, it's not very interesting to look at. But it was also put into the context of peak oil at the time, and that had a lot of traction with the public. Conversely, environmentalists wanted to talk about the sacred spaces. Inuits wanted to talk about the importance of habitat, especially for caribou. But the imagery that went along with that tended not to give those big landscape depictions. They close-up photos of herds of caribou or polar bears, which have become the latest sort of canary in the coal mine here. So the very way in which the aesthetics of that place were mobilized by each was in a broader story for both of them.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful discussion. I just want to ask you your opinion of this, because it seems to me in the discussion of renewable energy that something should be mentioned more often, and I don't hear it. The youth of our country, they're not happy with our capitalistic system, globalization, and the consolidation of power, wealth and power, especially in energy companies. So it seems to me we should be emphasizing the new paradigm that renewables represent, which is that distributed energy empowers individuals and communities to take charge of their own energy mix. So bypassing this consolidation of power, don't you think we ought to continue that discussion to attract the youth to this new paradigm and this new model?
Sounds like one for Karen.
Yeah. I was going to say absolutely attracting the youth, but I think that with renewable energy, education is critically important. Education for the youth and then for older voters, so that they can understand that renewable energy is important for climate change, important for the environment, but also I think that an emphasis to attract the conservative voters as well is about economic activity and jobs, because that will really resonate. So this is a very complex and complicated subject, but there are many, many benefits for renewable energy that need to be explained and that the education needs to go along with it. And we need to do a better job of that.
Yeah. Framing renewable energy as a consumerist relationship, and especially an individualist approach to this, is something going back to Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog. From the very beginning, he was framing wind and solar as an individualistic, get-off-the-grid sort of way of going about this, and that has always had some appeal to it. But let's not forget that the two most important renewable energy resource developments in U.S. history were the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Bonneville Power Administration, both of which are massive bureaucracies that create their own backlash by the public as well. So we have to think not just about the technology, but about how it's imposed. And one of the problems with all these is simply scale. We know that certain, to produce and transmit a tremendous amount of energy, you have to operate at a scale, and that drives some environmentalists crazy because of the huge dams that we end up with in certain places, which is a renewable resource.
And Marion has a comment before we wrap up.
I think a good example to compare in terms of younger people willing to branch out and try something different is the no-till agriculture. It was a generational example, a perfect example of how younger generations are willing to take no-till as a new approach to soil conservation and avoided runoff of nutrients, for example, and pesticides as well. And taking that approach for renewables, I think, will have the same effect. In terms of willingness to try distributed energy. And anaerobic digestion for livestock waste is a perfect example. It's been more successful in California, but very slow to take off in other states. We're starting to see examples here in North Carolina, and again, it's a younger generation that's showing that interest. But with distributed energy, also, there's going to be a significant amount of logistics and technological infrastructure decision-making and development that has to go on as well.
And I just want to say that the political process is really critical for renewable energy because we have to have the political will from the legislators to provide incentives and requirements for renewable energy for it to be successful. And that's very much the political process.
And so how do you motivate the politicians? They have to understand that the people want something. And how do you educate the people? When we started Oceana, we had a big rollout. We had $300,000 to spend on announcing Oceana. And the ad agencies just laughed at us. And they said, do you know how much Budweiser spends every month to penetrate the public consciousness? And it was like 3 or 4 million a month. So it's going to take a lot of educating people about what's going on, I think, to generate some political will.
So we can continue more informal conversation over our brief break. We're going to reconvene at 10:15 with the next panel, but please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today.